Body cavity. A body cavity is any space or component or potential space in an animal body. Cavities accommodate organs and other structures. Cavities as potential spaces contain fluid. The two largest human body cavities are the ventral body cavity and the dorsal body cavity. In the dorsal body cavity, the brain and spinal cord are located. The membranes that surround the central nervous system organs, the brain and the spinal cord in the cranial and spinal cavities are the three meanings. The differently lined spaces contain different types of fluid. In the meanings, for example, the fluid is cerebrospinal fluid in the abdominal cavity. The fluid contained in the peritoneum is a serous fluid. In ammoniates and some invertebrates, the peritoneum lines their largest body cavity called the coleum. Human body cavity. The dorsal posterior cavity, the ventral anterior cavity are the largest body compartments. The dorsal body cavity includes the cranial cavity, enclosed largest body compartment. The dorsal body cavity includes the cranial cavity, enclosed by the skull and contains the brain, and the spinal cavity enclosed by the spine and contains the spinal cord. The ventral body cavity includes the thoracic cavity enclosed by the rib cage and contains the lungs and heart, and the abdominal pelvic cavity. The abdominopelvic cavity can be divided into abdominal cavity enclosed by the rib cage and pelvis contains the kidneys, ureter, stomach, intestines, liver, gallbladder and pancreas, and the pelvic cavity enclosed by the pelvis and contains bladder, anus and reproductive system. Ventral body cavity. The ventral cavity has two main subdivisions, the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity. The thoracic cavity is the more superior subdivision of the ventral cavity and is enclosed by the rib cage. The thoracic cavity contains the lungs surrounded by the thoracic cavity contains the lungs surrounded by the pleural cavity and the heart surrounded by the pericardial cavity located in the mediastinum. The diaphragms from the floor of the thoracic cavity and separates it from the more inferior abdominopelvic cavity. The abdominopelvic cavity is the largest cavity in the body, occupying the entire lower half of the trunk. Although no membrane physically divides the abdominopelvic cavity, it can be useful to distinguish between the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. The abdominal cavity occupies the entire lower half of the trunk anterior to the spine and houses the organs of digestion. Just under the abdominal cavity anterior to the buttocks is the pelvic cavity. The pelvic cavity is funnel shaped and is located inferior and anterior to the abdominal cavity and houses the organs of reproduction. Dorsal body cavity. The dorsal body cavity contains the cranial cavity and the spinal cavity. The cranial cavity is a large bean-shaped cavity filling the most of the upper skull where the brain is located. The spinal cavity is the very narrow thread-like cavity running from the cranial cavity down the entire length of the spinal cord. In the dorsal cavity, the cranial cavity houses the brain and the spinal cavity encloses the spinal cord. Just as the brain and spinal cord make up a continuous interrupted structure, the cranial and spinal cavities that house them are also continuous. The brain and spinal cord are protected by the bones of the skull and vertebral column and by cerebrospinal fluid, a colorless fluid produced by the brain which cushions the brain and spinal cord within the dorsal body cavity. Function of the body cavity. These cavities contain and protect delicate internal organs, and the ventral cavity allows for significant changes in the size and shape of the organs as they perform their function. Anatomical structures are often described in the terms of the cavity in which they reside. The body maintains its internal organization by means of membranes, sheaths, and other structures that separate compartments. The lungs, heart, stomach, and intestine, for example, can expand and contract without destroying other tissues or disrupting the cavity activity of nearby organs. Thank you.